think it's a real understanding of the market is huge in terms of who is interested in wellness and who wants to feel better or look better, whatever their goal is. I think the difference is for a gym operator, we are definitely a little bit more targeted in terms of who that core customer is.
Welcome to this week's Escape Your Limits podcast. Today, we're speaking with the managing director who sits at the helm of one of the UK's first major big box fitness chains. He joins us to share his personal insights about how his business has had to evolve over the last 24 months and why innovation of their products and programming has become a competitive advantage to address the needs of their clients. In our interview, we discussed how to stand out in a crowded market and the importance of aligning your brand message with your customer needs, the power of collaboration and why a gym chain has partnered with an iconic nightclub brand, fitness equipment trends on the gym floor and what is the next big trend likely to be, and the pros and cons a big box operator needs to consider when trying to enter the boutique space. So please welcome the Managing Director of Fitness First, Mr. Lee Matthews, to this week's Escape Your Limits podcast.
So Mr. Lee Matthews, it's been a long time. Welcome to the Escape Your Limits podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Good to see you again.
So a lot's happened. I didn't realize actually you'd had a slight period where you'd left Fitness First for a little while and did some Weight Watchers.
I did, yeah. So it was back end of 2018. So got a really good opportunity to move across to what is now WW. So obviously everybody I think has probably heard of Weight Watchers, but going through what at the time was just about to launch their transformation and rebrand to WW. That was when I started having conversations. Really exciting. Spent 12 months there. Actually really enjoyed it. But actually the opportunity to then come back here and ultimately the role that I'm in now was a little bit too good. So yeah, it was a really good decision. So glad I did it. It was one of those that sometimes the thought in your own head that you spent a long time in one business, and albeit Fitness First had transformed massively over the years. So I feel like I was in different businesses over that period within Fitness First, but sometimes there's that thought in your own head that, how long am I going to be here? Can I continue to progress? Can I continue to stretch myself? So actually moving away and also moving away from the sector, because clearly WW, albeit there's a slight crossover within wellness, they're obviously not in the fitness industry. It's not a gym. So moving out of sector, not knowing anybody in the business was a really steep learning curve. Really enjoyed it. And I'm glad I made the decision, but also glad that I'm back.
So it was one of the things I was going to ask you about, Lee, because when we say they are out of the sector, it's quite an interesting thing because, I was curious to say, well, how far out are they? Are these sort of people that are potentially at some point likely to want to get involved in exercise and find a place to work out, or are they just like, so far? I don't know too much about the organization, but I'd just be interested, now you've sort of seen both sides of the fence as such, what link, if any, is there into the traditional space we're in now?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was one of the questions I was not only asking myself, Matt, but asking them. So when I was having the conversations with them in, early and into spring 2000 and then summer 2018 about the opportunity and the role, and, ultimately then was lucky enough to get offered the role that I ended up going on to do. One of those questions was, what actual sector are you in? Because clearly gyms, right, so there's the fitness sector and then there's the wider leisure sector, and right, where does WW, or obviously what was Weight Watchers at the time, where do you fall in? I mean, ultimately they're a membership subscription business that for years and years since the 1960s has specialized in weight loss. The rebrand to WW was very much, clearly they've still got that core element of a high percentage of their membership base, and it was all up and around 5 million globally. A high percentage of that membership base were there for weight loss. Some of them been there for years, some of them are joined and rejoined. It was high percentage of female. But actually what the transition to WW was going to be very much about was how can they move into the wider wellness sector. So clearly weight loss is still going to be that core element of their customer base, but how can they transition where it's maybe not just about weight loss, it's about wider wellness and whatever wellness means to them. And that was when they did start to bring exercise or fitness or activity was the main word that they used into it. So I think they'd always, or my understanding was for years, talked about fitness and activity and the importance of it. They talked about mindset and, how you feel and the importance of that. But the core content of anything within their program was very much food and points and understanding the impact that had on your weight loss. They were trying to bridge that gap where, all right, how do we elevate activity a little bit more? How do we elevate mindset a little bit more within the digital proposition as well as their physical offering? So it was starting to blur the boundaries where their members, who some of them didn't exercise at all outside of maybe walking, which is fine by the way, of course, but actually how do you get more of them into exercise? And what that started to then see was gym partnerships. So whilst I was there were a few pilots with UK-based gym partners. They were doing the same in the US. So in the US, they were partnering with 24-hour fitness. I'm not sure if that's still in place, but they were starting to blur these boundaries of actually putting tools and solutions and partnerships for their members for fitness. So I don't think you would ever probably call them a fitness operator, but there's definitely a crossover in terms of that wider piece with their members.
After being through that experience, did it make you think that the sort of pie that we're going after was potentially a lot bigger if we could understand how to find a way of communicating and talking to some people that are probably on a very, very basic level? Did that change your perception, or is it still sort of fairly removed from what you're probably doing in some of your clubs, for example?
There's a lot of differences, absolutely. I think to answer your question is the size of, call it the customer base who's interested in, and again, if you use that word wellness, that's so wide-reaching. Wellness can ultimately be whatever it means to you in terms of, do I want to look good? Do I want to feel good? Is it something that I'm literally trying to achieve? I might have a specific goal, or just want to feel better about myself, or is it more aimed at wanting to feel better because there's a certain trigger at the end of it? I think the difference that if I try and compare a gym operator, and clearly gym operators are very different, but clearly if I compare myself and in Fitness First to the likes of WW and that market, I think there might be a small crossover of call it your core customer. So when I think about our proposition at Fitness First, it's definitely younger. It's definitely more about fitness being the primary reason that I would go to Fitness First. So I want to, whatever my goal is, it might actually be still more of the mental side of my goal than physical. I want to feel better, but I want to feel better through exercise and activity. And then obviously you've got your products and services that want people, whether they do classes or PT or just train on the gym floor or swim or whatever it may be. So I think the big difference is it's a slightly different market in terms of more targeted. I think WW was, and I suppose could still be, because I'm not clearly as close to it now that I've left, a much wider reaching. They've got a big core base, as we mentioned, for weight loss, and food was that core piece. But actually then trying to tap into, well, actually, people who are interested in fitness, WW can offer that as well as, or people who just want to feel better, WW can offer that as well as. And then they were starting to do pilots and a lot of research into the likes of sleep, which wasn't necessarily something that they had in their program as a core offering, but understanding the major benefits of sleep and what that means for weight loss, wellness, how you feel, and the whole knock-on effect. So I think to answer your question is yes, there's a massive crossover. I think it's a real understanding of the market is huge in terms of who is interested in wellness and who wants to feel better or look better, whatever their goal is. I think the difference is for a gym operator, we are definitely a little bit more targeted in terms of who that core customer is.
There's a lot that's changed over the last couple of years. You've obviously had a period where you came out of the business that you've been in for a long time, and we've gone through a pandemic where I suppose the definition and the needs of people from health, fitness, wellness has probably changed. So in terms of Fitness First, where you're at the moment, Lee, how would you say that the pre-pandemic trajectory that the business was on has changed, if at all, to probably where you are now, specifically in terms of the needs of the people that you're servicing?
It's a real interesting one, Matt, because the trajectory of the business is clearly very different. We were a highly profitable business that was, I suppose, very much in the iteration stage of a lot within products and services. So, we had a very strong core offering across the majority of what we did, and it was about how do we get a little bit better in all of those. Don't know, the odd thing, i.e. digital, might have been a little bit more of a transformation, because clearly this is something that pre-pandemic we were very much looking at and working on, and how do we accelerate this. But in a lot of other cases, it was a strong business. Every single club was profitable. Obviously, certain ones had a little bit more individual challenges. But clearly now we're in a business that is still very much in the recovery stage. We haven't got the membership level yet that we had pre-COVID. Clearly we're on the build up to that, and we're growing, and it's going well in certain areas and a little bit more challenging in others, i.e. the city clubs are still a little bit more challenging. So still very much a growth and recovery period in terms of business trajectory. To answer your question in terms of the membership or the customer and the target, so we are definitely different as a business now, and that's partly because of what happens to this business that you're aware of, where we were DW Fitness First. The DW part is no longer this business anymore, so we are now Fitness First, and that was what came out of the back end of last year. So it's a 45 club estate now, which is Fitness First, and that's a very different Fitness First than what Fitness First was in 2016 when the DW brand acquired it. So what we couldn't do is go, right, well, what do we stand for as a brand now? Do we just go back to what Fitness First brand values and purpose and vision from 2016? Well, you can't do that, because that doesn't make sense, because we're not that business anymore. We're clearly not DW Fitness First anymore. So we had to go through a piece of work, for all the right reasons, by the way, in terms of building the entire brand strategy again. So everything from, well, what actually are we now? What's the purpose of Fitness First? What do we stand for? What are we known as? What is our vision in terms of where we want to take this business over the next 3 years? Then the likes of the brand values, are they still relevant? The answer is yes in a lot of cases, but in others, well, no, actually we need to completely evolve these now. And then clearly that flows into, right, well, what are all of the initiatives, the objectives? What do we need to do in terms of where do we develop? Where do we need to innovate? Where do we stay strong, etc.? So the business has very much changed and is continuing to change, because clearly that's a transformation project that's going to continue and take us a while. So your question about the member, the knock-on effect of that is then part of that strategy was trying to be really clear on, well, who's our core customer profile now, and what does that look like? And it's given us the opportunity to actually try and define that better. So it hasn't transformed in terms of, the members in Fitness First now completely different to pre-COVID. Well, a lot of them are still the same, because they've just froze their membership and they've come back, which is fantastic, of course. Some of them who have cancelled and rejoined. The one big difference that we have seen, which is really interesting, Matt, is that we've seen in terms of new joiners, so people that have started joining, if you just take it after the final lockdown, so April the 12th this year, when we reopened after the third lockdown in the UK, through to now, we've seen a much younger new joiner than what we've had. So our average age within Fitness First of average members was around 37, and that was consistent with our new joiners. What we're seeing is our new joiners over the last few months have been 28, 29 and 30. So clearly we're getting older people as well, but our average age of new joiners is younger. So that's a real interesting shift. But in terms of then behaviours in the club, products, services, we're still seeing similar behaviours. The only real shift again, and I know a lot of gym operators are seeing this because they report on it, is the average usage of our members is higher than what it used to be. So the members who are using the club are more active than what they were pre-COVID. So I suppose those are the two big shifts. We're seeing a slightly younger new joiner, and we're seeing more active members that are actually using it.
Thank you for supporting the Escape Your Limits podcast. If you're thinking about creating a unique and engaging fitness space to take your fitness to the next level, then we have you covered. Escape Fitness design and manufacture some of the most innovative, attractive, and durable functional training and free weight equipment used by many of the best trainers and fitness brands across the globe. As a valued listener, we are offering you a 10% discount off many of the products on our website. You can check out the full range by going to escapefitness.com and use the code dumbbell. That's escapefitness.com using the code dumbbell. That's it from me. Please enjoy the rest of this interview.
So how much do you think has caused those changes by people's movements? I've not been to London, but I was in New York recently, and you kind of see what's happening. A lot of people have sort of moved out of the city because a lot of the offices are not open as they were. There's still working happening in some places, and people seem to have developed other patterns, and so the clubs that were around the sort of tube stations and that sort of thing are not quite what they were. So have you noticed any of those in terms of people's commuting habits and people living in the city and out of the city, and how that's sort of affected what goes on in different clubs in London?
Yeah, we're very much a tale of almost three categories within one business at the moment, and it's so within our 45 clubs, we've got our residential clubs. So we define a residential club where the high percentage of the members live in that area. So I live in the Birmingham Solihull area, and that's why I'm a member. I'm there. We then have our city clubs where the high percentage of those members work near the club. So I don't necessarily, some do of course, but a very small percentage live there. The majority of people, I train at that gym because that's where my office is, and I commute in and I commute back out, and that's where you see the typical first thing in the morning, lunchtime and evening peak periods, and very quiet in the daytime. And then we have a middle category, and there's only a few of these clubs where we call them Resi City. So they are central London, but actually they've got an element of residential around them. So as an example, we've got Baker Street and the likes of Camden are two of those clubs. So they're central London. So there's a number of people that do have their workspace or their office, and that's why they use those clubs. But we also have some residential that people live in, and Marylebone as an example that use Baker Street, or live in Camden that use Camden. So what we're then seeing, Matt, is that the return and growth of, when you look at those three categories, residential clubs return very quickly, strong in terms of new joiners. A lot of existing members return straight away, whether it was April or May, and some of that was depending on their own circumstances, but pretty much strong growth all the way through. Our residential city clubs are doing well, not quite as strong as the residential clubs, but similar trends where clearly every single club has got less members than it did. But if we compare the likes of new joiners versus a pre-COVID similar period, so if you talk the period of 2019, you've actually got the residential clubs and the residential city clubs are joining more members than those same months in 2019. So that's really good, because clearly if that continues, we'll grow and get back to our membership base. The big challenge is the city, and that's defined again where we said where people who use that based on their office, and that is still quiet. The positive is it's significantly busier than it was, but where those two categories of residential and residential city are joining more people than a pre-COVID month in 2019 as an example, the city clubs aren't yet. So we've still got typical London clubs, as you know, a number of them are in buildings, and we might be ground floor or basement. So the offices that are above us or the offices that are next door to us and offer, you only have to walk around some of our clubs and all you can see is empty seats, empty chairs. We are seeing a return. So as an example, where those summer months was around 30 to 40% of a pre-COVID either new joiners or visits and swipes are very, very quiet in comparison. That all of a sudden September jumped up to 60% of pre-COVID. So pretty much doubled what it was in the summer, but it's still obviously way off where we were from a pre-COVID perspective. So we're almost seeing it month on month. A lot of the feedback we're getting from, because we obviously have a lot of corporate clients that we're in touch with and understanding when are they bringing their workers back, or are they bringing their workers back? Are they going to stay flexible permanently or just for a while? A lot of them have been doing it slowly. So they might be back in the office, but maybe they're only back in 1 or 2 days a week, and then they're giving their teams flexibility for other days. Others are still just trialing it, so maybe they're bringing certain teams or certain departments back in, but everybody else is still remote working. And then others might be telling us that, right, actually, we've got a date, this is what we're doing, we're looking to bring everybody back in whenever that may be. A lot of that was September and October, and there's a few that are happening this month. Anybody else is pretty much telling us January.
I know it's quite early, but we had an interview with the guys from ClassPass a little while ago, and they were sharing some of the information about where people are actually working out. It was mainly US based, but I believe there was some data from Europe as well. But I wonder if, from your perspective, do you see that when you're thinking about building new clubs, that because of what's happened, then there may be a slight change in footprint? Because I guess for Fitness First, it's been, from what I know about the brand anyway, it's been predominantly where you've kind of dominated this sort of central London. You've been one of the brands that have been kind of all over central London in terms of sort of pretty dominant. Do you see that sort of changing, or is it still quite early days?
It's definitely early days, so it's one of those really difficult. How do you predict it? So what will happen? We honestly believe that the city will return. Well, when we say in the city, we're talking London. I know other cities in the UK are, of course, similar in certain areas. Maybe it's not quite as affected, but London, it will return. It will come back. It might not necessarily be the same business in every office, because some are telling us where they may be subletting certain floors or whatever it may be, but London will return, the city will return. We're already seeing it. What is really interesting is that, you know, you're going from, and this is obviously the anecdotal type of feedback that sometimes makes you feel better, you know, getting the tube all the way through the summer or trying to get a coffee through the summer. It was just a really strange experience, because we all know what London tubes are like at peak times. We all know what it's like trying to meet someone for a coffee at lunchtime in London. Best of luck trying to get a seat. You've got no chance pre-COVID. So going into coffee shops, I mean, first of all, in the spring, they weren't necessarily even open. You know, a Starbucks or another brand, it was closed in central London. That was really strange. And then it went from the summer months where clearly they were open, but you'd have been the only person in the queue and, you know, take your seats if you wanted to go in there. And similar for the tubes, you know, there was hardly anybody on there. I'd be traveling, you know, I don't live in London, so I travel in. It wasn't even about trying to get a seat on the train. It was, you know, which carriage do you want? It was a bit of a running joke that there's nobody in my carriage, never mind sat next to me. What you're now seeing, Matt, is that trains are extremely busy again. Tubes are extremely busy. You're queuing for coffee shops. So all of these indicators, I know that's very anecdotal. There's no data or stat, or there are data and stats, but I haven't literally got them in front of me. The data and stats show, but so people are in London, people are back, and that's workers, that's residential, that's the likes of students that started coming back at the back end of September and early October. So we genuinely believe the city, albeit it's a slower trajectory at the moment, but it is jumping a lot quicker. It will come back, it will return. So to answer your question, apologies, a long-winded answer. When we start to think about newer clubs and investments, there's no way we will be thinking outside of London. London would still be our primary focus. We're still investing in our clubs. We'll still be developing new things in London as a starting point. We're a London-centric business that will work out from there. So as and when new clubs come up as an opportunity, we still believe the city is one for us to look at.
One of the things that we've noticed in all industries, and also in many different countries as well, is the challenges around labour, just for whatever reason, people are slow to come back, or particularly in the fitness sector, a lot of trainers have obviously realized that they can probably do this on their own, and they've gone and set up their own businesses and boot camps and personal training and that sort of stuff. And I was watching your sort of Win Together video on LinkedIn when I was sort of preparing for this, and I was just sort of curious to know, because you employ a lot of people, just curious to know sort of what are some of the people challenges that you've had, and have you been identifying or noticing any wants and needs that are changing from the people now since coming back after the pandemic?
There's a lot of changes. So, some of it is absolutely driven by COVID, the pandemic, changes to people's personal lifestyles, and you can completely understand that in terms of, they've potentially changed. And it could be a London specific one as an example. They're no longer in London. They've decided to move elsewhere. So then actually their job doesn't form part, or that certain job doesn't form part of it. There are others where it might be more of a commercial decision for them. And you gave an example of PTs there. So we run a self-employed PT model, and a number of them, of course, were successful throughout the lockdown periods where they moved their business online, whatever channel they decided to use, and some of them are successful with it. And at the moment, they're still very much engaged with us, and that's really interesting. But what's working for them, and they're not having to pay rent to access a gym, then fantastic. So they've maybe made the decision at the moment not to come back. But a lot of those reasons are more so the city clubs, again, where we're being as transparent for all of the right reasons, being transparent with all of our teams, and that includes the likes of our personal trainers. So even though they might not be employed, we're sharing membership data, we're sharing swipes in terms of how busy the clubs are, because also ultimately we're all in it together and everybody helps grow. So the last thing we want to do is try and bring PTs back that can benefit us, and actually the business might not be there. So what we're hearing from a number of PTs is that actually, look, I want to come back. However, the swipes in my club, be it a central London city club, that's not busy enough yet. All of my client list that I had pre-COVID, a number of those are not back in the office yet. So when I start to see the club getting busier, I absolutely want to come back. So for some, it's a personal decision. Maybe I'm not in London anymore, or my own situation has changed, or my own motivation has changed. For some, it might be more of a commercial decision, like the PT as an example. And then the only other difference is we're seeing, and this is more us in terms of what we've changed and not necessarily anything to do with the pandemic or COVID, because we are very different as a business now. And as I mentioned, relaunching what the brand is and what we stand for and what the purpose of the knock-on effect of that is that some people might actually start to realize, and they are starting to realize, that maybe this isn't me anymore. And that doesn't mean that they're a bad person or they're not good enough for their role. But if I just pick one example, the general manager role, so our club general managers, is just so different from what it was. We were still very much, from a general manager perspective, the traditional fitness operator, where they were highly accountable for new joiner, sales performance, all of the activity around that, appointments, lead generation, managing their sales teams. Clearly, they then ran the operations of the club. And as you know, Matt, obviously we've spent a lot of time over the years. We tried where possible as a brand to stand for our fitness experience and our products and our innovation. So clearly the general manager was involved in that, but maybe they were always more gravitated towards the sales number, and that's what they were managed on, and that's what they were fully bonused on, as in 100% of their bonus was in and around sales and new joiners. So naturally their focus would gravitate towards that. That's not the case anymore. And by the way, we were changing that anyway, but we just accelerated it because of the lockdowns and COVID, where we are now a full digital acquisition business. We're still hybrid, of course, so clearly members can still go into the club and join in the club. But what has been the transition from April this year through to now, if I just take last month's stats as an example, we were over 75% of all of our new joiners joined outside of the club, as in they weren't in the club. So through our digital channels, whether that was from an above the line perspective, or whether it's paid activity, or whether it was just organic, or whatever it may have been. But the general managers are not necessarily driving that number anymore. They don't make appointments. They don't make phone calls. They're not going out doing some of the old school advertising, the likes of leaflets. That might still have its place in the future. Who knows? But at the moment, we're not asking them to do that. We're asking them to contribute to the likes of. So as an example, if somebody does come in the club, well, your job is to deliver, your team's job is to deliver a fantastic experience. And hopefully on the back of that, they'll convert, they'll join. That is what you can be accountable for. And we can measure that. We can see how many people are going into the club and joining on the back of that. Or if you're a city club, as an example, well, you're going to have a corporate membership base. So what you can do is build better relationships with our corporate clients. So whether that's a benefits manager or a HR director or whoever that may be, you can, because that's a definite personal relationship. We're not going to try and do that digitally. That's about you building a relationship and understanding, are they back yet? Or when are they coming back? What can we do to invite you in, make you feel comfortable, understand all the safety precautions, etc. But what we've done, because then we're saying all of that other time, resource, focus that you and your team used to spend on sales, because we can now drive that centrally through the marketing team and digitally, and we're getting very similar results, as I mentioned earlier, which is great. Actually, yours and your team's focus, forget the sales things I just talked about, is all about service and experience. So we no longer walk into a club and there might be 5 or 6 people on shift at that time, but 3 or 4 of them are in the office making calls, or 3 or 4 of them are out of the building doing leafleting or whatever it may be. Absolutely not. Now we're walking into a club and everybody is, I might be at front of house or I might be on the gym floor, but everybody is member facing, deliver a service, deliver an experience. So that was part of, and one small example, the transformation we're going through in terms of what do we want to stand for. So a long-winded way again of answering your question, where some general managers were brilliant at the old way in terms of loved and were passionate about driving that sales number. And it doesn't necessarily mean they've been doing a bad job recently, but actually maybe they're making their own decisions in terms of, I'm not sure that new profile of general manager is me anymore. I'm not sure that's the type of, so we've seen, not a lot, by the way. So we've seen about 8 or 9 general managers who we maybe wouldn't have expected, long-serving general managers, have left us over the last couple of months. And I suppose that gives you the positive opportunity of bringing in that right profile that can be, taking us forward to what we want to be.
Right. I want to come on to product now, and this is an interesting one to me because I've worked with your organization for many, many years, and I've worked with you as well on a number of projects. And one of the things that always stood out, and I know people will say, well, there's a lot of innovative companies in the fitness space, but one of the things I think I can say with a high level of certainty is you guys have always been innovators from when, I believe it was called freestyle areas. So everybody now has functional training spaces. You guys were probably one of the first ones to actually create, define, program these functional training spaces, and pretty successfully from what I understood. You were then one of the first people to come up with, probably in London, boutique studios. Beat was one of the first places many, many years ago before boutique really hit London. So I see you guys as sort of leading that space. And then also in the group exercise field, it was always something that you used to see that there was a lot of effort gone into. What do you see now in terms of, I suppose, Group X and boutique, which are sort of different ways of packaging a similar thing in some respect? What do you, two things, what do you see is sort of happening now in the market that you're in regarding the traditional Group X space, the sort of boutique concepts that you've been involved in, and where you see that sort of going? Is it a revert back to the traditional studios? Is this now important? Is it a case of having to really up the game and do more of these sort of club concepts? I was just sort of curious to see how you specifically see that now.
Yeah, if I'm totally honest, I think so. Wider, maybe outside of fitness first, my opinion of classes and workouts and whatever, I still genuinely believe there is a place for what is maybe been around for a long time. Members still want to do a aerobics class in a certain part. They still want to do, a dance class. They still want to do a traditional group exercise, combat style, that has still got its place, absolutely. However, what we are seeing and what I genuinely believe is that place is more residential in terms of, so as an example, maybe that mid-morning, 9 a.m., 10 a.m., 11 a.m. type slot, we are seeing that in our residential clubs, there is still absolutely a demand for, it might not necessarily always older, but it might be a slightly older than our average age member. And there's still a demand for that type of class that they've done for years. Fantastic. They love that class and it works for them and it keeps them moving. That's brilliant. We're not necessarily seeing that demand is there within the city. And again, I don't think that's anything that's new. That isn't because of the pandemic or COVID or we've started to see that transition. That's why the likes of, like you mentioned, freestyle, we started that in 2008, and then obviously it's massively transformed clearly over the years. But the likes of, we don't call it FGT anymore, but FGT was our freestyle group training program. So our classes within that gym floor space, which we really started to accelerate around 2011, 2012, and it clearly evolved. We now call it different things, so our signature products have got different names, but we still absolutely run those. We started to see that the numbers in those classes were in city clubs and then certain other clubs with maybe a slightly younger member or maybe a more progressive member or someone that was more attracted by it. Those numbers started to outweigh maybe what was always associated with a traditional group exercise class. So that's really interesting, and that's continued, by the way, and we're still seeing that now in our own clubs. So larger answer is I genuinely believe there's still a place for what is traditional classes, traditional workouts. Members still want that, absolutely fantastic. But there is definitely a more progressive member, some of that is younger, not always, that wants more of that higher end, experiential, more advanced, whatever the word might be for them. And boutique operators have definitely got a part to play in that. So when I start thinking about some of our classes, because I go to some, I suppose you could call them our competitors. I don't necessarily always see it like that, but I go to some of the boutique operators. We do their classes, myself and some of the team, and it's just good to experience, because sometimes it gets you out of your own environment, but it's good to experience as well, to go, right, well, what are our takeouts from this? What are our learnings? What are they doing well? What can we steal with pride, if that's a relevant thing to do, whether it's experience-based, whether it's the music, whether it's the vibe, the atmosphere, the systems, whatever that may be. What we're seeing is that our signature products, so the likes of our shred class, or the likes of tracks, which is one of our newest rollouts this year, or our rocks class, which is boot camp with boxing, you are definitely, and again, it's anecdotal, but if you go into those classes in our clubs, you will see a very similar customer profile in terms of maybe age, look, how they come across, as you will do in a traditional boutique operator that's doing whatever they are doing. When you see one of the more traditional classes, at 6 p.m. or whatever it might be, you don't necessarily see that same younger profile. You might see a complete varied, of course, but yeah, it's very, very different. So I think the opportunity for us, and we will continue to innovate, because that younger demographic, in terms of wanting to train more regularly, wanting to spend more money on their wider fitness, activity, wellness, that is definitely a growth market for us. So we'll continue to understand, right, well, where are the trends? Is that something that we can partner with somebody? If it is, fantastic. If it's not, is it something that we then go and create ourselves and it then becomes a signature product? But we'll definitely be continuing to listen, understand what's out there, test it, trial it, and if something works, we'll
So you, as I said earlier, you've definitely been in this a lot longer than most people, including a lot of the boutiques. And you've done both models. You've had the sort of kind of experience in a traditional studio room, and you've done it where you've had the lights and the music and everything that goes with that. And you've also had the difference in trainers as well. So if you had to kind of look at what makes that a success in terms of these thriving boutique, I'll call them boutique concepts. So what would you boil that down to? Is it a case of, look, you've got to get the room right, you've got to invest in the lights and the sound? And I know it's probably a combination of all things, but if you had to sort of see the things that really rose to the top, where, look, that's one thing that if you don't get that right, you're screwed. What would you say some of those important things are?
So I think there's a difference. So I think if you are a standalone boutique, because we had experience of that with Beat, and then obviously as part of the business, we had a couple of other clubs where we trialed standalone as well. There's a huge difference between trying to make that successful in isolation, even though it's part of a wider network. The reality is that building on its own, getting people to go into there, that is in isolation, making that successful. That is very different to call it a club in club concept, whether you do a very similar thing or not. And the reason I think that is that to try and get somebody to go to your facility, call it your boutique, whatever it is, so we had Beat. So try and get somebody to go to Beat. Well, that is so different all of a sudden that we'd never experienced that before, trying to drive somebody into a facility where we've only got one thing on offer. And obviously we have a variation of classes, but effectively it is one studio. Well, we had two. We opened a spin studio as well. So you could argue it's two, but really it was one in terms of driving them in. You do a class and then you exit. That is so different from anything we'd ever experienced before, where clearly right now we've got a full service operation in all of our other gyms, and we always had, where people will come in and then it's more about, well, how can we signpost them to the library of products and services and which one would suit them better to hopefully make sure that they then come back and they come back more regular. So back to the difference is, because you're trying to get people to go in for this single thing on its own, and it can be perceived as expensive. I'm paying £20 or £25 or whatever it might be just for that one class versus 50, 60, £100 for a membership. I can go as often as I want and do that's very different in terms of the perceived value. So your question in terms of our learning was everything. It was the branding piece to attract them. This has got to come across as, cool, innovative. Why would I pay you 20 quid to go for that when I can be a member of a gym and go as often as I want? So you've got to get the branding piece right. Of course, that's so obvious. I'm not saying it's anything, of course, but that's so obvious. But then once I'm there, it's got to be that elevated experience, because why would I ever come back? Because it might not have been a repeat subscription payment. If I'm coming back and paying, there's a risk there, retail side, that they don't actually pay and come back a second time. So the facility, the vibe, the music, the instructor, the community element of how we connect them. So everything had to be elevated. The difference of doing that in our clubs is we clearly still want to deliver the best experience we absolutely can. Of course we can. But the amount we would have to spend, and we did spend, on this standalone boutique club, we don't necessarily need to do that. So if we want to create our Rocks concept as an example now, where we've converted, in one of our clubs, we converted a squash court. So it's a standalone studio. It's a standalone room that's got 8 treadmills and 8 boxing bags. So I can do a 16-person class, or I can actually put another 8 people if I wanted to do a middle row. So it's got the boutique feel in terms of it's a closed studio. That's not on the gym floor, but I'm already in the club. So actually, we've already done the branding elements in terms of getting them in. Actually, we've already got the experience within the club in terms of the flow, the vibe. We greet them at reception like you would do with any member. It then becomes actually just another offering that you can signpost people towards. So almost right, why would I ever need to cancel or leave this gym? Because if I want to do a traditional workout, whatever traditional might be in your words, if I want to run on a treadmill, or I want to do a HIIT workout using an assault bike or a ski erg, or if I want to do leg day, well, actually I've got my squat racks and my platforms and I've got my free weights and everything, but I've actually also got this Rocks concept, which is like a boutique studio, and I've got this Tracks concept, which is like a boutique studio. So because I'm in that environment, we're actually going, well, it's about adding value to keep them more engaged, retain them, offer more variety. So therefore, we didn't necessarily need to go as far in the isolated, make this studio as amazing as what a standalone would be, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So with I suppose traditional clubs that do that, as opposed to single clubs that have just one thing like a boutique studio, when it comes to, I suppose, specializing on a particular thing, how do you see that partnerships and collaborations are quite important? Because I was looking at your sort of traditional studio where you're clearly working with Les Mills, that arguably are sort of one of the best at creating programming in that space. I've just noticed another partnership that you've done on the music side with Ministry of Sound, which looks pretty interesting, and it seems to sort of add a different story to one of the tracks program, I believe that you're referencing. So do you see then, for as clubs evolve, rather than trying to sort of do all those things themselves, which is kind of what did happen, do you think now it's a case of considering some of these partnerships that you can bring in different areas to kind of have a sort of a department store concept where you got some of the best brands all under one roof in effect?
Yeah, my personal belief, and it's the approach we will take, so I can only talk from that side, of course, is that yes, partnerships, there's the right ones, of course. It's got to fit your strategic direction and understand what we're trying to do, and therefore who would the right partners be. And then you've got to hope, of course, that they would want to have a conversation and work with you if that's possible. But partners can just add tremendous value. So the likes of our Ministry of Sound partnership as part of rolling out tracks was, well, actually we've got this new gym floor based HIT concept called tracks, and it involves the equipment and the workouts and whatever else that you want to do. We're good at that, so we can partner with whichever equipment suppliers we want to purchase the equipment from. That's very transactional, of course. We can create a good environment in terms of, well, where's it going to go? What's it going to look like? What flooring are we going to use? What lighting? What branding, etc. So we can do that ourselves because we feel like we're good at that, and we'll tweak it and change it and obviously take learnings. But then there are other elements where you go, well, we're definitely not specialists in music, so we've got experience. We've got lots of fantastic group exercise instructors. We've got people within our programming team that can do a good job on it. But the reality is, who's going to do a better job? Us trying to get our programming team or our group exercise instructors, or do we have a conversation with the likes of Ministry of Sound, which we do? So go, well, we're creating this concept, and actually we want to make a bigger deal of it in terms of when this class is on. Could we do a specific Ministry of Sound bespoke playlist, complete takeover of that era of the club? And that was the conversation and where it grew. And we've done some experiential events as part of it. So it was about us going, well, if somebody can do something significantly better than us, and that makes sense because it fits, then absolutely that's a better idea than trying to create something ourselves. And you can use that example for so many other areas that we either do partner with people, or hopefully, we'll partner with people in the future.
As it relates to the gym floor, what changes are you seeing there? One of the things you mentioned is that you're starting to get a younger demographic in. One of the things I've noticed over here in the US is that a lot of trends that you're seeing on social media are very influenced by the gym and vice versa in terms of the way people work out, the type of exercises that people are doing. There's definitely even outfits that people wear. There seems to be a deep connection. So, are you seeing two things then? One, are you seeing the needs on that gym floor changing as it relates to the people that you got coming in? And if anything, how are you evolving that traditional gym floor space?
Seeing definite changes, and again, I don't think there's anything that is massively different post-pandemic. It's maybe just continued or accelerated a little bit quicker, or maybe it's a little bit more exaggerated. So where if I think back to, Fitness First rebrand 2014, 2015, where it was very much about, cardio, traditional cardio was still popular. Classes, of course, were still popular. Free weights were popular and busy, but it wasn't this mass demand. And that was where, for us to get freestyle, which was obviously the rollouts that you talked about, which we started in 2008, 2009, and then continued to iterate and develop. And what it ended up becoming was freestyle, so functional, is either the central point of the club and everything feeds off it, or it was the first thing I would see in the. So depending on the orientation of the club, it would be the first thing I would walk into. I wouldn't walk into rows of kit. It wasn't about a commoditized environment. I would walk into this open space with maybe a rig and kettlebells and TRX and Vipers, and there'd be cardio and free weight, and everything would be connected to it, or it'd be the front part. That has absolutely still got its place, by the way, but to fit that in, we started to take out more isolated pin-loaded machines at the time because we just weren't. These are not getting used. These things are just gathering dust, and cardio is still busy. If you go in at peak time, treadmills are all still busy. So pin-loaded, this isn't getting used. Let's take that out to create space. What we've now started to see, if I accelerate that all the way forward, is that free weights in any club, by the way, is bursting at the seams. You can't get enough benches in there. You can't get enough dumbbells. You can't get enough squat racks and platforms and cables and whatever else. Pin loaded is starting, funny enough, isolated training, isolated machines starting to get a demand. So we started to bring stuff back in and whatever else. Freestyle.
Just on that, Lee, does that tend to be like movement specific? So like, a glute machine, for
Correct.
example.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. So like glute machines or people trying to find somewhere else to use it, or abductors and adductors. We took all of those out and brought them all back in because everyone's using them in different ways, by the way. Some people standing up on them and whatever else that you see. So that's really interesting. And what we're seeing is the real shit is that all of a sudden now traditional cardio is the one that this isn't full anymore. So even where a club might have had 15, 18, 20 treadmills, we might now be down to say 10 or 12, call it traditional treadmills because we have different versions, but call it your traditional treadmill. And you can go in at a peak time. I'm not even talking a city club, by the way. I might be talking a residential club, which is very busy. The treadmill's not all being used, but the free weights area is heaving. The pin loaded kit's all used. The classes are busy. The freestyle area is still really busy. So that was absolutely the right decision, and that's still built. So it's definitely seen this shift of when people are doing now, call it cardio, assault bikes, ski ergs, rowing machines, and then how do I integrate that with other pieces of kit? We're seeing that as such a shift. So when people are doing cardio now, we're seeing that they're dragging an assault bike over with a kettlebell and they're setting up their own little boot camp style circuit workout rather than what might have been perceived as cardio. I'll go on the treadmill and then maybe the cross trainer and the bike. So definitely started to see this, and because of that, that's where we're continuing to invest, obviously. So the investment that we have done this year, other than opening a couple of new clubs, is how do we extend and enlarge our free weights areas? So that's doing things like we've moved the likes of squat racks and lifting platforms into our freestyle area because it just fits that whole functional movement. I mean, what is functional? There's a different conversation there, but actually able to Olympic lift and squat and deadlift, well, that can go in the functional area because it fits. So that then all of a sudden opens up space in your traditional free weights area where you can put more dumbbells, more benches. So yes, we've seen definite shifts, and I expect that to continue. I don't see a change in any time soon.
So final question, Lee, because we're on a bit of a time limit today, but I wanted to just get this one in. So you've obviously come in a leadership position. So congratulations for doing that and taking on the challenge. But my guess is being a leader in regular times is not easy, let alone sort of coming into a company that's just that's just kind of had a change in ownership, that's dealing with a pandemic and everything that goes with it. So my question to you, Lee, is how have you had to escape your limits as an individual to be able to have taken on that challenge and I suppose evolved yourself to be successful in the role?
That's a big question, Matt. I think the big thing for me is sometimes it's really, really easy to give advice, but then actually find yourself not necessarily living by the advice that you're giving, if that makes sense. So if I pick one example, because we're going through such a transformation in this business, we're making mistakes and we'll continue to make mistakes because we're doing things that we've never done before. So what feels like a really good idea, actually we test it, we trial it, and we're trying to do it in the right way in terms of without just jumping ahead and making a decision in the absence of data or rational reasoning. We then take the learnings from it. So what we're talking about and what I talk about quite a lot with the teams is that when you're going through change, but you're in an industry that you've got a lot of experience, it's really easy to remember what worked in the past. So, well, actually, if we're talking about how do we get better from an acquisition perspective, or how do we improve our NPS or CSAT ratings within our membership base, or how do we get more people into classes, or whatever the example might be. We've done all of those things, so it's so easy to remember, oh, well, do you remember the last time we had that project or initiative? This is what we did. Well, let's just do that. Well, that's not relevant anymore because we're not that business. So we talk about thinking instead of remembering. So actually, what are we trying to do? Why are we trying to do it? What type of business are we now? As in, what's our purpose? What's our vision? We use OKRs in terms of our tools to manage projects and initiatives. So what actually fits now, and what's the data that we use to move it forward? So to answer your question, I think it's very much about, it's really easy for me to be the leader and give advice to my team about, well, this is what we need to do and this is how we need to approach things. But I have to be that person in terms of me, because I'm lucky that I've got a lot of experience, not only in this business, but also the industry. So I could easily be the worst person in terms of, here's a brilliant idea that I think I've got, and it's actually just something I'm pulling out from however many years ago that I've already done. That would be a mistake. So I think it's a constantly challenging myself, because I'm new to this role. I've been in this MD role for 12 months. I'm massively privileged to be here, loving the role so far, but I'm still learning clearly in this position because I haven't done this before. This was a step up for me. I'm hoping I'm doing the right thing and I'm hoping I'm doing a good job, but I've got to continually push myself, test myself, stretch myself, because it is a challenge.
I love that statement about thinking instead of remembering. I think that's something that we can all, particularly when you've been around and been in the industry a long time, I think you can easily fall into that. And I think now more than ever, it's important to just be conscious and aware of things, and instead of going onto that sort of automatic, let's just keep rolling forward. So I think that's great advice. Well, look, I've known you for a long time, Lee, and if your track record's anything to go by, you're going to do a fantastic job in this new role. I appreciate your time, and hope to get to speak to you again in the near future.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I really appreciate your time. Brilliant to speak. Thank you so much for having me on. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, then please go over to iTunes and subscribe to the Escape Your Limits podcast. Leave a review, leave a comment. It really would help us a lot to continue to keep these going.